Welcome back to Yev's Builds, and in today's video we're going to be installing the oil pumps and the Vanos oil pump and adjusting the proper lash, and that is very crucial and it's very cool but tedious, so stay tuned. First of all, this little filter, gotta remove it, gotta replace it. Here's how it looks like. It's like this. Here's the part number for you. Gotta replace it. So what you wanna do is you wanna take something sharp, so like some flat nose pliers or something really small, dig in there and it should come out. Just like that. That's the old one. Toss this one. Whoop. Just like that. Take a little hammer, like a little rubber mallet or something, and just kind of tap it in there gently. Just like that, it's nice and flush. Moving on, filter's in, that's it. Next up, you wanna put this tensioner in. Pretty much it's gonna be pushing up on this little guide, and it's gonna push the chain and give the chain the tension. But before you put these two in, I already put this in. There's a little, I don't know if you could see it, inside there, you see that? There's like a little stopper and like a guide for the spring to sit on. Gotta put that in first. Put the little spring in, put this little guy over at the cap. And that's donezo. So first off, if you have not yet replaced the Vanos high pressure oil line, a lot of times if this fails, chances are your motor's taking some big damage. So, I mean, mine's already replaced, but if you haven't done it yet, do it. When you're applying the oil pump, make sure, if you're replacing the chain, of course, when you're removing the sprocket, make sure that the chain goes around this little, this area right here. It's for the mounting bolt. Make sure it goes around just like that, because this smaller little tab, this little guide, is going to be sitting against this, and then these teeth are going to be sitting up against the crankshaft. Yeah, and that's that. And then you take your banjo bolt, and of course you got to replace your pressure washers on them, but that's where the high pressure Vanos line sits. If you do not replace this, a lot of times, I mean, that's why people are scared to buy these motors, because when this oil pressure line fails, a lot of times it causes bigger issues down the line, and that's the biggest problem with these. So you apply that, don't tighten it all the way, not quite yet. Make sure it's going in nice and free. Give it a couple, a couple turns, do a hand tight. Seat it down between these guiding pins, specifically for the bolts. This is done. Leave this here for now. See how this has movement? The sprocket, it's sitting up against the crankshaft. That's the movement that we're going to be adjusting. To adjust lash, dude, this is absolutely mind-boggling to me. The precision of engineering of this stuff is mental. When you're doing this job, when you're adjusting the lash, tighten the 3 mounting bolts of the Vanos oil pump semi-hard, not enough for you to freely move around with your hand, but enough to where you kind of tap it, then the adjustment moves, right? And we zeroed out the gauge. You can buy this kind of gauge anywhere. This I got off Amazon. I mean, the more money you spend, the more accurate it's going to be. This is magnetized. You set it down onto the harmonic balancer just because that's metal, and the rest is aluminum and doesn't really grab onto anything. You put that pin somewhere in between the teeth. See how it's zeroed out, and the slack on this? It's 0.4 to 0.5 of a millimeter. The perfect spec for this is anywhere from 0.06 to 0.08 of a millimeter. That's the tolerance that this pump is allowed to have. You want to tighten at least one bolt, just a smidge. Take a hammer, something, a mallet or something, and give it some gentle taps. If you move it down towards that way, the lash is going to get tighter, which means the tolerance is going to get thinner. And if you punch the pump that away towards the cylinders 6 through 10, then the gap of tolerance opens wider. So we're a little bit short. This is at 0 to 0.5 of a millimeter. We need 0.6 to 0.8. So we'll give it a few taps that away. That didn't do much, right? And this takes a lot of time, but that's what it has to be. We're getting closer. It's more in the 0.6 range now. If it's along, if it's somewhere in between 0.7, that's just that sweet spot. So that's what we're going to try to do. So eventually, you kind of find that adjustment point where you tighten the bolts down ever so slightly. Enough for when you hit this oil pump itself, it moves ever so tiny bit. You know what I mean? So eventually you'll get it to about 0.7 mil. So what I'm going to do now is tighten down the bolts pretty generously now, just because it's already pretty much perfect, and I'll check it again. If it's going to be checking out again, that means we've done a pretty good job, and we can torque them down all the way and keep moving on. We torque down 2 more, so let's zero it out again. Bingo, 7. Perfect. Maybe even a little bit less, maybe like 6.5. Alright, 7. Alright. Seems promising, so we'll just torque it down. I could not find the torque specs for this, so don't over tighten it, but you don't want to do too little. So just feel it out. Check it once again. It's about right, homie. See, now it's 0.6. A little bit too little. So what I'm gonna have to do now is I'm gonna have to loosen the bolts just ever so slightly so I can give it a couple more taps, and that way I can just bring it to perfect spec and move on with this. So this is very tedious, but that's the way to do it. With time and patience, eventually you can get it down within tolerance. As you can see, it's about from 0 to 0.7 of a millimeter, and that is within spec. Anything from 0.6 to 0.8 is within spec. So just take your time, be patient please, because dude, this took me probably a half an hour. Keep in mind when you tighten these bolts down, when you tighten the mounting bolts, that lash changes. So once you tighten them, give it a few tight squeezes, check your lash. If it's bad, adjust it. If it's good, tighten a little bit more, check it again until your torque is great and it's solid and it doesn't move anywhere. And there you have it, that's really it. Next up, we take the heart of the engine, the oil pump. Before you apply, you have to remove the sprocket. There's a little nut on it, and there's the sprocket itself. You got to remove it, otherwise you're not going to be able to put this chain on. But pretty much it's just going to sit neatly and perfectly into where it's supposed to be. Take your bolts and you want to tighten them down to the actual block itself. Really, obviously the longest one, it goes into here. Every bolt that attaches to the bed plate of the block is supposed to be tightened down to 20 Newton meters. Okay, this is kind of medium one. Goes into here. Little guy goes down in there, So this little bolt over here, that's 9 Newton meters. Torque that down. So that's 20, 20, 20, and 20. Everything's torqued down. Great. Then we apply some red Loctite all along this. And now you want to take your sprocket, feed it into the chain. Just like that, push down on the tensioner so that you can actually put your chain on. Put that on, make sure it's nice and snug. Gotta replace this nut, mine was replaced. And this is supposed to be torqued down to, let me check. That is 25 Newton meters. Boom, 25 Newton meters. It's a size 16, boom. 25, let's check the tension. Not bad, we'll double check that. This little sucker in. Roughly 10 Newton meters also. Next up, we're going to be checking the tensioning travel of the chain tensioner. So this right here, you see how it travels, right? It gives a certain amount of tension. If you look over here, it says the perfect dimensions are 72.5 millimeters to 80 millimeters. Anything over 80, you pretty much have to put shims underneath that. So let's check ours. Take a little caliper gauge like this, right? You put it behind this rail right here, and you let that bottom piece sit on the bottom of the bottom tensioning rail, right? Tensioning guide. You let it sit on it, and you see how there's a gap? Mine's already leveled out and I already measured it out, but it's supposed, when you push on it, this piece is supposed to sit flat on it. If your measurement is about 72.5 in between 80, then you're in the spec, and that's exactly what we're at, which means, you know, obviously if we replace the guides and the little tensioner down in there, we're good in spec, so that's good. I'm just gonna put the oil pan on without the gasket, just temporarily, simply because I'm gonna need to stuff this freaking V10 into an M3, which means I'm gonna have to cut the oil pan just a smidge. If you don't know already, the V10s and the V8s of that era, they don't have a dipstick, an oil dipstick. So one of the further projects that I'm gonna be doing is also fabbing up an oil dipstick. I already have one ready, somewhere in there. I can't even find it, it's somewhere in there. There's a dipstick ready, and we're gonna be mounting that on. We're gonna make it go around the headers and all that. So, dude, regardless, stay tuned. There's a ton more work to do, so dude, you know what to do. Subscribe and just do the rest. I know it's cliche, but it works, so thank you, peace.